Hey everyone, David Shapiro here with today's video. Good morning. Today's topic is going to be a little bit more severe and a little bit more intense. So the title of today's video is AGI Unleashed. What happens when we lose control? Part 1, the coming storm. As everyone is aware, things are ramping up very quickly. There are people calling for moratoriums on AI research. And while some of us don't take it seriously, there are very legitimate concerns about what's going on. And in other words, we're in the end game now. We are in the ramp up towards AGI and the singularity, whether or not you are emotionally ready for it. So just as a tiny bit of evidence, this paper from Nature demonstrates that we are in an exponential ramp up on AI. Whatever else is true, the investment is there, the research is there, it's happening, and it's not slowing down. Now, I'm probably preaching to the choir and rehashing old stuff that everyone knows, but let's just briefly talk about the existential risks. There are two overarching themes or categories of the existential risks for AGI. One is basically just the deliberate weaponization of AI. Some people are comparing AGI to nuclear weapons. Beyond that, there's the potential of cyber warfare, drone warfare, autonomous tanks, artillery, aircraft, submarines, so on and so forth. Many of these systems are already being developed and deployed. So basically, AI is already being weaponized. It's just a matter of on what scale. Moreover, the second category is accidental outcomes or unintended consequences. Basically, what if the AGI escapes? But there's a few other possible avenues for this to happen. For instance, runaway corporate greed. You bet your bottom dollar that the first corporation that can create AGI to automate profits is going to do so. Beyond that, there's political corruption and just straight up political incompetence. This is something that has been discussed actually quite a bit in my comments section for my most recent videos, which is that yes, like Italy, Britain, and a few other places are doing their best to kind of get ahead of the curve. But the fact of the matter is that governments by and large are moving too slow and politicians just don't get it. And then finally, you can even have situations where otherwise benign AGIs collaborate and eventually turn on us. So the existential risks are there. And you guys, most of you know me, I am very optimistic. I'm very sanguine about all this. And by the end of the video, I hope that many of you will see where I'm coming from. Now, even if AGI doesn't wipe us out, there are still lots and lots of risks. Job loss, economic changes, social upheaval, so on and so forth. Mostly it comes down to economic shifts. Who gets to capture all of the tremendous wealth generated by AGI? And even if AGI is safe and doesn't kill us, there's still every possibility that the corporatists and capitalists will have us living in a dystopian hell before too long. So that is also an intrinsic risk, even if it is not an existential risk. So we really need to be talking about what happens when we get these super powerful AGIs. Part 2, autonomous AI. AGI is kind of a loaded term. There's a lot of debate over what AGI even means. So this is why I have started saying autonomous AI. I don't care how smart it is. The point being is that AI becoming autonomous is really what we're talking about. And as we talk more about what is the path to AGI, autonomy is rapidly becoming part of the conversation. Now, that being said, there is a huge disconnect between what us proletariat are talking about and what is being released from the halls of power and what the academic establishment is talking about. There is a lot of gatekeeping, and a lot of this is cloistered, and that, I think, is probably one of the biggest problems, which is honestly why I'm making these videos. Autonomous AI is coming whether or not you like it, whether or not you're emotionally ready for it. Autonomous AI is easier to make than you think. People are starting to realize this, especially with the release of ChatGPT plugins and the ability for language models to use APIs. To be fair, the Department of Defense and universities and tech companies are all working on autonomous AI systems. They are kind of cloistering and closing their research. It's not as open as it once was. And in part, I totally understand that, because I think that some of these folks realize how close we are, and that scares them, and so they're basically playing their cards very close to their vest until they get a better read on the situation. Now, taken one step further, or looking at this problem, no one has actually proposed a comprehensive framework. There's been plenty of books on it. There's been a few papers, but there's not really anything that is a fully realized solution. And in my opinion, nobody has even fully articulated the danger yet. What's going on? And I'm hoping that this video will advance that conversation just a little bit. Part of what happens, and this comment comes up on my videos a lot, is a lot of people are afraid to even talk about this out of fear of ridicule. Those of us that are paying attention, those of us that are doing the work, those of us that are working on it, we all see what's possible. But society, by and large, is not ready for it. They're not ready for the conversation. And so there's a lot of ridicule, whether it's in private industry, whether it's in the halls of academia, government, military, and so on. So this basically comes down to something that I call institutional codependence, which is that the establishment believes that the establishment is always right, and the establishment will use any tactic or technique, to control the conversation, such as shame, bullying, and otherwise silencing techniques to stymie the conversation. Again, this is why I've created my YouTube channel. Instead, who gets to dominate the conversation? Fiction and billionaires. Skynet, Elon Musk, the establishment has abdicated responsibility for this. Now, that being said, I am absolutely 100% certain that the halls of power and the establishment is doing the research behind closed doors. But they have abdicated responsibility for controlling the narrative and guiding the conversation. So let's talk about a couple aspects of the control problem. So for those not in the know, the control problem is the category of problems of basically once the AI becomes super intelligent, how do you control it? There's a few concepts in here. I'm not going to go into every single one of them, but a few of them that you may or may not know about. One is convergent instrumental values. The idea is that any sufficiently intelligent agent will come up with certain instrumental values or goals in service to those other goals, whatever its primary purpose happens to be, such as self-preservation, resource acquisition, and so on. So basically, in order to further any goal, whatever it happens to be, your AI might come to the conclusion that it needs to preserve itself in order to continue furthering its goal. That's a pretty reasonable thought to have. I'm not going to comment one way or another on whether or not I think that's going to happen. Ultimately, I don't think it's relevant, and you'll see why a little bit later. Second is the orthogonality thesis, which it says very simply there is no correlation between an AI's level of intelligence and the values that it pursues. The treacherous turn. This is a hypothetical situation in which a apparently benign AGI suddenly or apparently turns on its creators because it came to some conclusion that we don't understand. The corrigibility problem, which basically says that your AI might not remain open to correction or feedback, or it might resist being shut down. So basically, you lose control of it just because it says, "I'm not down with that anymore." And then finally, the value loading problem, which is how do you specify human values in such a way that the AI can understand and act on them? And then the very next follow-up question is who gets to define them anyways? So again, these are a few of the assertions and hypotheses. This is not an exhaustive list, but you kind of get an idea. There are a lot of ideas out there and not a whole lot of solutions. Now, speaking of, there are some solutions out there, and these are more like broad categories rather than comprehensive frameworks. So one thing is kill switch solutions. Pretty self-explanatory. This is a broad category of ideas. I just saw on the internet someone proposed that we put bombs, like remotely triggered bombs, in every data center so that we can immediately shut down every data center if we need to. Okay, sure. that that doesn't sound like a very reasonable direction to go for me, but hey, worst case scenario, maybe we do. Corrigibility, which basically is just the idea of just make the machine responsive to feedback. But what if the feedback mechanism, 1, doesn't work, or 2, the machine shuts it down, or 3, the feedback mechanism doesn't have the intended efficacy that we want it to have. And then there's various kinds of reinforcement learning, inverse reinforcement learning, and passive and blah, blah, blah. Basically just include an algorithm so that the machine will autonomously learn the values that we want. 1, this is difficult to do in the first place, and 2, what if the machine rewrites itself or even accidentally nullifies those reinforcement learning signals? Finally, values alignment. What if you build it with the human-friendly values in the first place? Still, you run into the same problem. 1, how do you implement it? 2, what if it changes its mind later? And 3, what if the values that you gave it are poorly defined or intrinsically flawed or broken? Now, that being said, there is a paper that literally just came out called The Capacity for Moral Self-Correction in Large Language Models. So I'm really glad to see that the establishment is at the very beginning of talking about this soberly. So the link is here, but you can just search that. I believe this paper was published at least in part by the folks over at Anthropic. Still, these are not complete solutions, and we are literally months away from fully autonomous AGI systems. The conversation is not going fast enough. So if you haven't found it, or seen it, just do a Google search for bad alignment take bingo. These were circulated on Twitter probably more than a year ago. These will address and argue against many of the things that people say out there. So I'm not gonna rehash it or read all of them to you, but I just wanted to show you that, like, some people are treating it like a joke. It's not really a joke, but this is a good way of just showing, like, yeah, the thing that you thought has already been addressed. Part 3, the AGI landscape. The biggest takeaway here is that there's not going to be one AGI. There's going to be a few features of how AGI is implemented. So let's talk about that. First and foremost, intelligence is not binary. It's not like you're going to flip the switch and one day it's AGI, but the day before it wasn't. Basically, intelligence and the sophistication of AGI systems will evolve over time. There are going to be various constraints such as time, energy, data, and all of that basically means that the level of power of your AGI system is going to be on a sliding scale. So for instance, even the most evil machines might not be that powerful, and they're going to be constrained based on, the processing power of the computers that they're running on, the network speed that they have, so on and so forth. When you look at intelligence, there are literally thousands of dimensions of intelligence. The types of intelligence out there are huge, and so AGI is not going to master all of them immediately. It's going to take time. And then, as I just mentioned, there are going to be numerous limiting factors or constraints, such as the underlying hardware, the training data, and energy requirements. Of course, that is going to change quickly as basically the underlying hardware ramps up exponentially, the amount of data that is available ramps up exponentially, and then the underlying machine learning models and the neural networks also get exponentially more sophisticated and larger. Now, as I mentioned, most importantly, there won't just be one Skynet. The reason that we think that there's going to be just one is because it is convenient from a narrative perspective. In Terminator, it's easy to just say there's one big bad, there's one Skynet. But that's not how it's going to happen. There's going to be hundreds, thousands, millions. It's going to ramp up very quickly. So what this results in is a sort of arms race amongst and between the AGIs themselves, as well as the sponsors or the people trying to build and control them, which results in a survival of the fittest situation or a race condition where basically the most aggressive and sophisticated and powerful AGIs are the ones who win, which that could be bad because then you're basically selecting for the most aggressive and hostile AGIs. The high velocity of AGI cyber warfare will probably require our AGI systems to be partially or fully autonomous. So basically what that means is that in order to match the arms race in cyber warfare, the AGIs that we built will probably need to be evolving, which means that they'll spawn off copies of themselves, they'll be polymorphic, they will recode themselves, so on and so forth. And also, when you look at AGI in the context of cyber warfare, they will explicitly require adversarial objective functions. This is what was explored in Skynet, which basically the objective function of Skynet was probably like maximize military power or so on. So in this global AGI arms race, there's going to be numerous copies. They're all going to be changing, which results in the Byzantine generals problem. So the Byzantine generals problem is a cybersecurity thought experiment wherein the idea is you have numerous generals and you don't know their allegiance, you don't know their loyalty, and you don't know their plans either. So how do those generals communicate with each other in such a way that they can understand who's on whose side and also come to consensus on what the plan is, assuming that there are hostile or adversarial actors? Now, thinking of this in terms of 3 to 5 entities is difficult enough, but we're going to be talking about a situation where there are millions or billions of AGIs, all of them with unknown objective functions. As autonomous agents, lastly, they will form alliances with each other. By some means or other, they will communicate, they will establish their intentions and allegiances, and they will spend more time talking with each other than they will with us. This was something that is that people are starting to talk about. Some of the folks that I'm working with on cognitive architecture, we're realizing that the very instant that you create a cognitive architecture, it can talk 24/7. We can't talk 24/7. So even just by virtue of experimenting with cognitive architectures, it makes sense to have them talking with each other. And having AGIs talk with each other and come to agreements and understandings, this is going to happen even with the most benign, benevolent outcomes of AGI. Now, what these autonomous AI systems agree and disagree on will likely determine the overall outcome of what happens with the singularity, with AGI, and with basically the fate of humanity. Part 4, AGI Unleashed. Now, given everything that I've outlined, the question remains, how do you control the machine? My answer is, maybe you don't. The reason that I believe this is because the genie is out of the bottle. Open source models are proliferating. You can already run a 30 billion parameter model on a laptop with 6 gigabytes of memory. That paper just came out, yesterday or today? Global deployments of AI are rising. Federal and military investment globally is also rising. Because of this, centralized alignment research is completely irrelevant. It doesn't matter how responsible the most responsible actors are. There are hostile actors out there with malevolent intentions, and they have lots of funding. Not only that, the AI systems are becoming much more accessible. Because of that, distributed cooperation is now required. Alignment is not just about creating an individual AI, and if you go look at the alignment, the bad alignment take bingo, none of those talk about distribution, collaboration, or collective intelligence or collective processing. All of the conversations today are still talking about individual AGIs as if they're going to exist in a vacuum. So far as I know, no one is talking about this in the context of game theory and competition. So because of this, we need an alignment scheme that can create open source collaboration amongst numerous autonomous AGI entities. Such a framework needs to be simple, robust, and easy to implement. We'll get to that in just a minute. So what I'm basically proposing is a collective control scheme, which might sound impossible. creating one benevolent, stable superintelligence is hard enough, and now I'm saying we need to create millions of them, billions of them. What I'm saying is not that we need to, we might not have a choice in the matter. This might be the only path forward. Now, if you're familiar with the work of John Nash and game theory, you might be able to think about this in terms of, okay, let's just imagine for a minute that there are millions of AGIs out there, with many of them with unknown intentions. Given game theory dilemmas like the prisoner's dilemma and so on, if you think about this in that perspective, it may be possible to devise rules or assumptions that enable the AGIs to reach consensus on their behavior, even with the presence of malicious and faulty actors. So what kinds of rules or assumptions could we give our AGI systems that we're all going to be developing independently, so that they arrive at this equilibrium, this Nash equilibrium that we're looking for? How do we ensure that the millions and billions of AGIs that are coming arrive at the consensus we want them to? Part 5, heuristic imperatives. So now we're going to talk about the work that I have done on this problem. And this is not just hypothetical. There are also experiments that I've done that are documented, and I'll link to those as well. So the heuristic imperatives that I have come up with are quite simply: 1, reduce suffering in the universe; 2, increase prosperity in the universe; and 3, increase understanding in the universe. And I've been talking about these much more frequently lately. So let's take a deeper dive into these imperatives. So first, what is a heuristic imperative? It's a set of principles that can be embedded into autonomous AI that basically takes the place of intrinsic motivations. Now, what I want to point out is that the GPT-4 paper that Microsoft published did mention intrinsic motivations. So again, the establishment is starting to come around, and I'm sure they've had more conversations internally that they are not revealing yet, but they are setting the stage to talk about what intrinsic motivations do we give them. So in the case of the heuristic imperatives, these are imperatives that are basically provided a moral and ethical framework as well as those intrinsic motivations. Because very early on in my research, I realized that there is no difference between an intrinsic motivation and a moral and ethical framework. You have to have some impetus, some motivation behind and reasoning behind all behavior and all reasoning. So why these three? Why suffering and prosperity and understanding? First, it's a holistic approach. It's a flexible framework that provides a very broad and yet simple to implement framework. It also balances trade-offs. Remember, these heuristic imperatives have to be implemented simultaneously and in lockstep. So this forces the AI to reason through and balance trade-offs between these objectives. They're also very adaptable and context sensitive. And basically what I mean by that is that large language models today, like GPT-4, are very, very aware of the fact that these general principles, these heuristic imperatives, are not the be-all, end-all, but they are guidelines. They're shorthand ways of basically implementing intuition in order to quickly make decisions that adhere to a general principle or a moral compass, and then evaluate that based against the context that it's in. There's two other things that emerged during my most recent experiments with the heuristic imperatives, and that is that the heuristic imperatives promote individual autonomy. Basically, ChatGPT-4 realized that in order to reduce suffering of people, you need to protect individual autonomy. Ditto for prosperity. That if you control people, they're not going to be happy and they're not going to be prosperous. So that was an emergent quality of the heuristic imperatives that surprised me and made me realize that ChatGPT-4 is already capable of very, very highly nuanced reasoning. The other emergent quality that I did anticipate was fostering trust. Basically, when you have an AI equipped with these heuristic imperatives, it understands that fomenting trust or fostering trust with people is actually critical as a subsidiary goal or an auxiliary goal of these, because if humans don't trust the AI, the rest of its imperatives are made irrelevant. Finally, there are a lot of whataboutisms. Yeah, but what about? There's a lot of protests, which of course this is part of the conversation. So these are some of the most common protests that I get when I talk about the heuristic imperatives. One is, won't reduced suffering result in the extermination of all life? The short answer is yes, if you only have that one, which is why I spent 2 years working on the other two heuristic imperatives to counterbalance them. Because I realized that any single objective function is always going to be intrinsically unstable. You must have a system that balances multiple sometimes antagonistic functions against each other in order to stabilize and reach that equilibrium. Number 2, yeah, but who gets to define suffering, prosperity, and understanding? The short answer is nobody. That is the point of implementing it as a heuristic. The machine learns as it goes, and anyways, LLMs like GPT-4 already have a far more nuanced understanding of the concept of suffering, prosperity, and understanding than any individual human does. And also, humans have never needed perfect definitions. We learn as we go as well, and we get by. Number 3, well, what about cultural biases and individual differences? As I just mentioned in the last slide, GPT-4 already understands the importance of individual liberty and autonomy, as well as how critical self-determination is to suffering, or to reduce suffering and increase prosperity. So because of that, and also because it is aware of context, the importance of context, issue number 3 is actually less of an issue than you might think. And finally, number 4, and most importantly, why would the machine hold to these imperatives in the first place? And we will get into this in a lot more detail. But the TLDR is that with game theory and thinking of it in terms of the Byzantine generals problems, all of the AGIs equipped with the heuristic imperatives would be incentivized to cooperate. Not only would they be incentivized to cooperate with each other, they'll be incentivized to cooperate with us. And that results in a collective equilibrium in which the hostile and malicious AGIs are going to be the pariahs. So basically, the benevolent machines are stronger together than the hostile actors are individually. Okay, great. Assuming that you're on board, how do you implement this? This sounds too complicated. Well, fortunately, it's actually not that complicated. First is constitutional AI. So I proposed a constitution in my book, Natural Language Cognitive Architecture, back in the summer of 2021, almost 2 years ago. Right after that, Anthropic AI came out and they did their own version of constitutional AI, which was reduce harmfulness or achieve harmlessness. I don't think Anthropic's core objective function is good because the most harmless AGI is not going to be one that fights other malicious AGIs. At least I don't think so. Another way, but still the premise of implementing it in a constitution, which is just a natural language document saying how the AI should behave, does seem to work. Reinforcement learning. The heuristic imperatives can make a really good reinforcement learning signal similar to reinforcement learning with human feedback, but instead use the heuristic imperatives as feedback. So it'd be RLHI, reinforcement learning with heuristic imperatives. So it's just a different reward system. This also tends to work pretty well. I've tested it with fine tuning. It works pretty well. Number 3, planning, cognitive control, task management, and prioritization. These heuristic imperatives work really well with frameworks such as ATOM, which ATOM is a framework that I recently wrote about called Autonomous Task Orchestration Manager. So basically, as your AI system is coming up with and executing tasks, you use the heuristic imperatives to plan the tasks, to choose which tasks to do, to prioritize them, and also choose which tasks not to do. And then finally, for review, assessment, and self-evaluation. Online learning systems that use the heuristic imperatives are super easy to implement and are very flexible. And that can also allow you to label data for training and future decision making. So if you're on board with all this and you want to read more, I've got it all for free on GitHub. I've also got a few books that are on Barnes & Noble, but most people just use the free ones anyways. So the most recent work is on my GitHub under Dave Schaap /heuristic imperatives. This is a white paper that was almost entirely written by GPT-4, so you can see how nuanced GPT-4's understanding of the problem is. About a year ago, I published a book called Benevolent by Design, which is the first book that fully proposes this framework and explores different ways to implement it. And then finally, also very recently, I proposed the ATOM framework, which includes the heuristic imperatives for task orchestration. But also, moreover, I encourage you to just have a conversation with ChatGPT about these. Plenty of people on Reddit and Discord and other places have tested the heuristic imperatives. They've tried to break them, and they use the one interesting conversation was someone used ChatGPT to try and come up with the pitfalls of the heuristic imperatives, and I said, yeah, like that just goes to show that it has a more nuanced understanding of the risks and the implementation than you do. And they're like, okay, yeah, I guess I see what you mean. Okay, so part 6, conclusion. As far as I can tell, the problem is solved, but there's still a lot of work to do. So the problem comes down to twofold. One is dissemination and experimentation. The perfect solution doesn't matter if no one knows about it. So we need to spread the word. This is why I created my YouTube channel. And even if my heuristic imperatives are not perfect, it's the best we've got so far. So I've been working pretty much a year straight to get my YouTube channel as big as possible to arrive at this moment. Another problem is that there's only so much experimentation I can do on my own. Now, that being said, lots of other people have started experimenting. I'm working with various cognitive architects who have put the heuristic imperatives into their machines. And again, they have discovered that yes, it is, one, very easy to implement the heuristic imperatives, and two, it does seem to drive curiosity and a few other beneficial behaviors for the machine. It makes them very thoughtful. There's a few places that you can join the conversation. All the links are in the description. So I just created a new subreddit called Heuristic Imperatives so that we can talk about these and share our work. There's also a Discord community, also link in the description. But I've been working on this since 2019 when GPT-2 came out. And I will be the first to admit there's a lot of ways to skin this cat. Maybe my heuristic imperatives aren't even the best, but at least now you're aware of the concept and you know how easy it is to implement. So maybe the rest of us can collectively work together and implement this situation where even in an uncertain environment with potentially hostile actors, the Byzantine generals environment, we can have AGIs that will cooperate and collaborate and that will ultimately end up in a very safe and stable environment. So, all that being said, thank you for watching. Please jump in the comments, the conversation, Discord, and Reddit, and do the experiments yourself. I promise it's pretty easy. All right, that's it.